Hello, boys and girls. I'm going to be doing a read aloud video every day, and you can watch the video and listen to the story on our YouTube channel that I have set up, where we will be doing the read aloud, and sometimes I'll do a little math activity or a science activity that you can watch. So the book I'm going to be reading is called The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane. It's by Kate DiCamillo, and it is one of my favorite books. I read it to my class last year, and they loved it. They begged to read the next chapter every day. It is about a fancy little rabbit and all of his amazing adventures through the book. The book uses a lot of fancy vocabulary, so I will stop and we will talk about the vocabulary that's used. I will also stop and ask you questions, and I will give you a few seconds to think of an answer, and then I will give you the answer, and you can just check yourself if you thought of the same answer, just to show that you are thinking as I'm reading. So I hope that you enjoy this book. We're going to start with chapter 1. I'm going to hold the book so that I can read it, and then when there is a picture, I'll turn the book so you can see the picture. Once in a house on Egypt Street, there lived a rabbit who was made almost entirely of china. He had china arms and china legs, china paws, and a china head, a china torso, and a china nose. His arms and legs were jointed and joined by wire, so that his china elbows and china knees could be bent, giving him much freedom of movement. Now, if you don't know what china is a very breakable, fragile material. You might have some china teacups at home, or maybe a vase made of china. So this little rabbit was made of china, so he was very fragile, very breakable, but his arms and legs could move. His ears were made of real rabbit fur, and beneath the fur there were strong, bendable wires, which allowed the ears to be arranged into poses that reflected the rabbit's mood: jaunty, tired, full of ennui. His tail, too, was made of real rabbit fur and was fluffy and soft and well-shaped. So you can see from the description, he is a very fancy, handsome rabbit. The rabbit's name was Edward Tulane, and he was tall. He measured almost 3 feet from the tip of his ears to the tip of his feet. His eyes were painted a penetrating and intelligent blue. In all, Edward Tulane felt himself to be an exceptional specimen. Only his whiskers gave him pause. They were long and elegant as they should be, but they were of uncertain origin. Edward felt quite strongly that they were not the whiskers of a rabbit. Whom the whiskers had belonged to initially, what unsavory animal, was a question that Edward could not bear to consider for too long, and so he did not. He preferred, as a rule, not to think unpleasant thoughts. So I want you to take a minute right now and think, what does Edward think of himself? Use what I've read, use the details to get an idea of how does Edward feel about himself. Okay, well, hopefully you thought of how that paragraph started with, Edward Tulane felt himself to be an exceptional specimen. So that tells us he thinks he is all that. He thinks he's quite a rabbit. But he is worried about his whiskers because he says he doesn't know where they came from. And he would not like it if his whiskers came from an unsavory animal, like maybe a badger or something ugly. Edward's mistress was a 10-year-old dark-haired girl named Abilene Tulane, who thought almost as highly of Edward as Edward thought of himself. Each morning after she dressed herself for school, Abilene dressed Edward. So now, after finishing that paragraph, you know we've talked about how paragraphs lead into the next paragraph. So, with it being said, Abilene dressed Edward. Now you know we're going to read about what she dressed Edward in. The China Rabbit was in possession of an extraordinary wardrobe, composed of handmade silk suits, custom shoes fashioned from the finest leather, and designed specifically for his rabbit feet, and a wide array of hats, equipped with holes, so that they could easily fit over Edward's large and expressive ears. Each pair of well-cut pants had a small pocket for Edward's gold pocket watch. Abilene wound this watch for him each morning. "Now, Edward," she said to him after she was done winding the watch, "when the big hand is on the 12 and the little hand is on the 3, I will come home to you." So I'm thinking that Abilene, this little girl who owns Edward as her little doll rabbit, takes very good care of him. So maybe you're thinking that you can connect to a special stuffed animal you have or a special doll you have that you take extra special care of. She placed Edward on a chair in the dining room and positioned the chair so that Edward was looking out the window and could see the path that led up to the Tulane front door. Abilene balanced the watch on his left leg. She kissed the tips of his ears, and then she left, and Edward spent the day staring out at Egypt Street, listening to the tick of his watch and waiting. Of all the seasons of the year, the rabbit most preferred winter, for the sun set early and the dining room windows became dark, and Edward could see his own reflection in the glass. And what a reflection it was! What an elegant figure he cut! Edward never ceased to be amazed at his own fineness. So you can see he really thinks he is beautiful and wonderful. In the evening, Edward sat at the dining room table with the other members of the Tulane family. Abilene, her mother and father, and Abilene's grandmother, who was called Pellegrina. True, Edward's ears barely cleared the tabletop, and true also, he spent the duration of the meal staring straight ahead at nothing but the bright and blinding white of the tablecloth. But he was there, a rabbit, at the table. Abilene's parents found it charming that Abilene considered Edward real, and that she sometimes requested that a phrase or story be repeated because Edward had not heard it. "Papa," Abilene would say, "I'm afraid that Edward didn't catch that last bit." Abilene's father would then turn in the direction of Edward's ears and speak slowly, repeating what he had just said for the benefit of the China Rabbit. Edward pretended, out of courtesy to Abilene, to listen, but in truth, he was not very interested in what people had to say. And also, he did not care for Abilene's parents and their condescending manner toward him. All adults, in fact, condescended to him. So, if we think about the word condescended, I'm sure that's a new vocabulary word for you. It means that they spoke down to him. So far we know that Edward thinks he's very handsome, very smart, very elegant. And for Abilene's parents to speak condescendingly, they speak to him as if they think he's not very smart. Only Abilene's grandmother spoke to him as Abilene did, as one equal to another. Pellegrina was very old. She had a large, sharp nose and bright black eyes that shone like dark stars. It was Pellegrina who was responsible for Edward's existence. It was she who had commissioned his making. She who had ordered his silk suits and his pocket watch, his jaunty hats and his bendable ears, his fine leather shoes, and his jointed arms and legs, all from a master craftsman in her native France. It was Pellegrina who had given him as a gift to Abilene on her 7th birthday. And it was Pellegrina who came each night to tuck Abilene into her bed and Edward into his. So isn't that funny that Edward has his own bed? Will you tell us a story, Pellegrina? Abilene asked her grandmother each night. Not tonight, lady, said Pellegrina. When? Asked Abilene. What night? Soon, said Pellegrina. Soon there will be a story. And then she turned off the light, and Edward and Abilene lay in the dark of the bedroom. I love you, Edward, Abilene said each night after Pellegrina had left. She said those words, and then she waited, almost as if she expected Edward to say something in return. Edward said nothing. He said nothing because, of course, he could not speak. He lay in his small bed next to Abilene's large one. He stared up at the ceiling and listened to the sound of her breath entering and leaving her body, knowing that soon she would be asleep. Because Edward's eyes were painted on and he could not close them, he was always awake. Sometimes, if Abilene put him into his bed on his side instead of on his back, he could see through the cracks in the curtains and out into the dark night. On clear nights, the stars shone, and their pinprick light comforted Edward in a way that he could not quite understand. Often, he stared at the stars all night until the dark finally gave way to dawn. So, that being the first chapter, we should have met the characters, which we did. So I want you to think in your head of our main characters. So you should have thought of our main character, Edward. He is our China rabbit who can think and feel and see things, but he cannot speak. Then you should have thought of Abilene, the little girl who owns Edward. We also met her mother and father, but we didn't learn very much about them. We did learn a little bit more about the grandmother, Pellegrina. So I want you to think a little bit about Pellegrina. Pellegrina is the grandmother who bought Edward and all of his fancy clothes for Abilene. Pellegrina also tucks Abilene and Edward into bed each night, but even though Abilene asks every night for a story, Pellegrina will not tell her a bedtime story. So I'm not quite sure what to make of that grandmother yet. Tomorrow, I will read chapter 2, and you can go to our YouTube channel and watch it and think about some of the questions that I ask. I'm going to send your parents a message with our YouTube channel name that they can find, and we will meet again tomorrow. Thank you. I hope you had a nice day today. I miss you. Bye.